In the Embraer original jets, like in other pressurized aircraft, the cabin and cargo compartment are incorporated into the sealed fuselage, capable of containing air under pressure higher than outside atmospheric pressure. Pressurized air is pumped into the fuselage by the bleed and air conditioning systems, and is released from the fuselage by the outflow valves. The adequate signal to control the outflow valves come from a digital controller in automatic mode, or from a manual controller in manual mode. Pressurization controls are located at the control pedestal. In the digital controller panel, there is a display of the selected landing altitude. A landing altitude switch sets the desired landing altitudes between minus 1,500 feet to 14,000 feet. A dump button provides rapid cabin depressurization and is effective only when in automatic mode. Another push button is fitted to allow switching from the auto mode to manual mode. The manual controller consists of a knob to select cabin rates between minus 1,500 feet per minute at down position and plus 2,500 feet per minute at up position when operating in manual mode. When operating in auto mode, the knob must be set to down. To dump the cabin in manual mode, the selector knob must be set to full up position. Cabin altitude and differential pressure are indicated in the ICAS, and color of indication is consistent with cautionary and warning ranges. Cabin rate in the range of minus 2,000 to 2,000 feet per minute is also indicated. Amber dashes replace the indication for rates out of this range. The operational principle of the auto mode is to maintain minimum cabin altitude according to the aircraft operating altitude, imposing minimum cabin rate of change, and ensuring that maximum and minimum differential pressure limits are maintained. Check the corresponding ICAS indications for a typical flight departing from a 2,100 feet pressure altitude airport and cruising at 26,000 feet. The digital controller does all the work, despite of the different operational conditions. Observe the pre-pressurization that takes place after full throttle is applied. During the pre-pressurization phase, you may detect an irregular cabin altitude variation, but this is normal. After takeoff, observe that cabin altitude is maintained at about 400 feet below takeoff altitude to satisfy internal laws on the controller. Observe the point where cabin altitude begins to climb. Anyway, this condition should not last longer than 15 minutes. Once in cruise phase, the cabin will stabilize at the lowest possible altitude, which is proportional to the cruise level. During descent, the automatic controller will change cabin rate according to airplane vertical speed, operating altitude, and selected landing altitude. Observe the point where cabin altitude stops descending. Finally, observe the automatic depressurization on the ground after landing. In manual mode instead, crew selection of the cabin rate and proper monitoring of cabin differential pressure is required to maintain appropriate cabin pressurization. Remember that, with relation to the 12 o'clock position, clockwise rotation of the controller will induce a positive rate of climb, and counterclockwise rotation will induce a negative rate of climb. Manual controller gain is sort of sensitive. Avoid fast and big displacement of the controller. In general, keeping the manual controller within the null rate mark will provide a cabin rate very suitable for your operation. This is also the area where you will find the null rates depending on flight condition. Manual controller actuation does not cause an immediate response to the outflow valve. After making cabin rates changes, wait a few seconds to verify if the resulting modification corresponds to what you want, and then repeat the procedure as necessary until the end result is the desired one. To address some reports of loss of pressurization and malfunction while in automatic mode, we are giving you additional information to assist the operation in manual mode. We hope that with these hints, the operation in manual mode is so simplified to a point that you feel safe to use it during your daily operation. Let's make a complete leg operating in manual mode. All the procedures have been performed using engine bleed. Receiving. Before door closing. Set the pressurization manual controller to full up position and press the mode selector to manual. Check that man appears in the button. Leave only one pack on. This setting allows one outflow valve to be fully open and reduce the cabin airflow, and thus avoid uncomfortable pressure changes when the doors are closed or during engine start. Taxi out before takeoff. Keep the pressurization manual controller to full up position. This setting will make the cabin altitude remain stable during taxi, independently of any variation in bleed. Just before takeoff, assure that the manual controller will be set at 11 o'clock position. This position will guarantee an acceptable pressurization during climb out. After takeoff, climb. During climb, close monitoring of differential pressure and intermittent setting of manual controller will be required to attain a desired rate of climb. The goal is quite simple: to maintain the cabin altitude below 8,000 feet and below delta P 7.8 with a comfortable cabin rate of climb. Follow the instructions to get it. Just after the initial climb, maintain the manual controller between 11 and 12 o'clock position within the null rate mark, such as to achieve a null or slightly positive rate for the cabin altitude. Passing 10,000 feet pressure altitude, turn the manual controller clockwise. Identify the resulting cabin rate. Usually a 400 to 500 feet per minute will be good for this situation. Above 10,000 feet, you've got also to check a table contained in the Quick Reference Handbook. Search for the Loss of Pressurization Indication procedure in the Quick Reference Handbook, and you will find a table over there. The job now is to maintain the cabin altitude consistent with the airplane altitude read on the table. So, if you're crossing 15,000 feet, and your cabin altitude indicates 1,000 feet, but the table tells your cabin should actually be at 1,300 feet, you can increase the cabin rate by rotating the manual controller just a little bit clockwise. This will put cabin back to the proper delta P. Conversely, crossing 15,000 feet at 1,700 feet cabin altitude requires you to reduce the cabin rate. Cruise. Once cruise level is established, or a step in the climb is desired, compare again airplane cruise altitude against a target cabin altitude in the Quick Reference Handbook table. Allow the cabin to climb, or to descend, to the value read on the Quick Reference Handbook table. Then set null rate. Cross-check delta P. If you did your job well, the indicated airplane altitude, cabin altitude, and delta P will be consistent with the table. Keeping the manual controller close to the 12 o'clock position to keep a null rate is a good position for the rest of the cruise. However, minor adjustments might be required. Descent. Just after you initiate descent, slowly turn the manual controller counterclockwise. Initially, set minus 400 feet per minute rate, which corresponds to a position between 12 and 11 o'clock in the manual controller. During descent, the task consists of setting a cabin rate that will meet the required landing altitude upon landing. Allow the cabin to descend slowly towards the desired landing altitude so that upon landing, delta P reads 0. During holding at any flight altitude, simply return the manual controller to around 12 o'clock position to set null cabin rate, and then reset the desired cabin rate when descent is resumed. Taxi in. Once on the ground again, the job is to equalize the cabin to the outside pressure. To get that, your delta P should read 0. Check indication on the ICAS. If your cabin altitude is lower than landing altitude and you have some residual delta P, turn manual controller to 2 o'clock position to get cabin up. Once delta P reads 0, turn manual controller to full up position. In this position, outflow valve will be kept fully open, which will equalize outside and inside cabin pressure. After that, you can open cockpit side windows and aircraft doors. In case of rapid loss of pressurization during automatic mode operation, set manual controller to 11 o'clock position and immediately set manual mode of operation. It has been observed that cabin altitude indication may vary under these circumstances. Therefore, it is recommended to wait till cabin altitude indication stabilizes, and then the manual controller should be operated as required to control cabin altitude. Remember, the manual controller gain is very sensitive, and that the response time to the command may take a few seconds.